Welcome, everyone. My name is Philip Jessup, and I'm your moderator today. I'm a member of TFN's lecture team and a TFN board member. Today, we're going to hear about ways that we can find new money to build our park system in Toronto. As many of you know, we're underfunded and we need more money to do that. But before we start, let's begin by acknowledging the land and the people of the land. The Toronto field naturalists acknowledge this land through which we walk. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. Today, it is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to be on this land. Let me welcome all of you joining us today, and please let us know through the chat how you heard about this event. It helps us plan future ones. We hope you'll come. If you're not a member of TFN, please join. The full range of membership perks include our excellent newsletter and many guided walks all over the city throughout the year, including this cold month of December. Thanks very much to the lecture team for organizing today's event. I will introduce our speaker, Jean-François Obregón, in just a couple of minutes, but be aware, please, we are recording this event. The recording we will make available online fairly soon on our website for those who have missed this particular Zoom. And let me also share a few Zoom tips. It's a very good habit to keep yourself muted unless you're about to ask a question during the Q&A period. Also, please turn off any videos you might have running. After the talk, please stay around to thank our speaker, Jean-François, and to join in the Q&A session. And Ellen will also offer some sneak peeks of upcoming events at TFN. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jean-François Obregón. Today, Jean-François will share with us his research on ways to unlock new potential funding for parkland, acquisition of parkland in Toronto. We hear a lot about the pressures. Hold on a second. Jean-François, can you turn off your share screen? That's great, okay, great. We hear a lot about the many pressures facing Toronto's public parklands with a rapidly growing population, and we hear about how some neighborhoods are not fairly served with enough local parks. But we don't talk enough about how we acquire new parks, and we typically hear that the cost is prohibitive. There isn't enough money, despite the very substantial health and well-being benefits that parks bestow on us. You may not know that Toronto actually has a substantial reserve fund for funding acquisition of land for new parks, but these funds are not easy for city staff to access. And Toronto is so far behind most other Canadian cities in expanding natural areas to keep up with population growth that we desperately need new innovative ways to finance acquisition of land using private capital, not just public. Jean-François will propose some options that work elsewhere and might be applied here. Jean-François holds a Master's of Planning in Urban Development at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson, where his major research focus was financial tools for parkland acquisition in Toronto, one of the very, very few people studying this issue. He has over 10 years of experience in financial services, public policy, clean tech, and media. He's also executive director of A Voice for Transit, an advocacy organization focused on transit equity in the GTA. Jean-François has published articles on investing in the circular economy, deforestation in Brazil's Amazon, and ensuring natural disaster risks. His work has been featured in Corporate Knights and Morningstar Canada, and he holds an honors in business administration from the Ivey Business School at Western, where he did an exchange term at the Rotterdam School of Management in the Netherlands. He's very well traveled and knowledgeable about policy options around the world to address the issues that we're concerned with today. Jean-François, I'm going to turn this over to you. So go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks, Phil. All right, so this is the title, Unlocking Potential Funding for New Parks in Toronto. It's great to be doing it for this group. And this will be the layout for today's presentation. I'll do a brief introduction, talk about my major research paper, the Planning Act, Section 42 specifically, a few financial tools and potential partnership options, overcoming bureaucratic barriers, and then the conclusion. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. First off, I'll tell you about one of my favorite Toronto trails, which is Cottonwood Flats. I found out that Toronto Field Naturalists was doing some restoration work there when I was doing my major research paper. And during the restricted phases of the pandemic, I spent a lot of time in nature, as I'm sure many on this call did as well. And this is one of the areas that I checked out when we were during that time. This was from July of last year. It's really nice. It's close to Thorncliffe Park. And what I thought would be helpful is if there were better directions, because it was hard to get there. But otherwise, it's nice to be doing this presentation right now for the group that is involved with this. So as Phil introduced me, this is just telling you a little bit more. So I worked at a company called Sustainalytics for 6.5 years. That is a company that does ESG work. So ESG stands for Environment, Society, and Corporate Governance. And they are a data provider to institutional investors who would be pension funds, asset managers, and sovereign wealth funds. And my job was to engage and research financial institutions and real estate firms, mainly in the US, Canada, and Europe. Since graduating from my master's degree this past spring, I have been working with Dr. Diane-Laure Archalier, who is a Ivy Business School professor at Western University, on how to incentivize regenerative agriculture being taken up in southwestern Ontario. We're working on this through a research funded project funded by the Institute for Sustainable Finance's Center for Sustainable Finance Network. And I'll tell you how I got into this or got interested in this. A key reason was that when I was at Sustainalytics, I was researching a possible project about conservation finance, because I was reading about how in different parts of the world, there were investors who were funding businesses in agroforestry and other areas so that there would be protection of biodiversity. And here's some cacao pods on a tree in Peru. And this is a project that has a UK-based investment firm that's been purchased by a French investment fund now. But they were involved in financing the sustainable cacao farm operation. And the goals were that you were reducing the risk of deforestation occurring because you're providing another revenue stream. And also the investment would be paid back because you'd have a markup on the product that would be coming from the premiums being paid for a great cacao product. So it got me thinking about how can we do something similar here, and how can that be applied to nature? Because there's also been a high amount of interest in recent years around financing nature-based solutions. So I'll tell you about my major research paper. I took this picture on a hike this past summer in around the Humber River, and after I took this picture, there's a beaver that popped out of it, so that was nice. This is in Toronto. And so the major research paper, when I was at Toronto Metropolitan University, I worked with Professor Nina Marie Lister, who I need to thank because she had this original and initial insight around how can we use reserve funds that exist in the city for purchasing parkland, which we're in need of in Toronto. So I started exploring that, and then at the same time, she had this idea, and we obviously worked on it together around how do we what other tools or options are there, right? Because traditionally, we might think, okay, we'll get public funding and then we'll just make it work, but there are jurisdictions around the world that are using different tools for this purpose. So the MRP started in May 2021, ended April 2022. I interviewed over 30 practitioners in development, government, nonprofit in Canada, Costa Rica, the UK, and the US. And since this, we released 2 reports, and since the last one was released, there's been an in-person seminar at U of T, a webinar done through City Building Ryerson. The work has been also featured in Nova Res Urbis Toronto, which is an industry publication for the planning world, as well as in the current issue of the OPPI, which stands for Ontario Professional Planners Institute, Y magazine, and also presented at the OPPI OALA conference. OALA stands for Ontario Association of Landscape Architects. And when I was doing the work, spoke with Phil. Thank you, Phil, for invited me to do this talk. And he had this great insight, why can't Toronto be known for its ravines if Amsterdam is known for its canals? So there's just something, a nugget that I think is worth sharing with all of you. So here are opportunities or or the state of play, let's say. So you have $221 million in Toronto as of 2019 in unspent reserve funds that can be used for parkland acquisition. I've heard the number is lower. I haven't seen that myself in a black and white document yet, but not too much lower. But anyway, this is the fund that can be used for that purpose. But it's also complicated in terms of how to spend that. So there's a problem. You have 211 million that's budgeted for parkland acquisition over the next 10 years as part of the capital priorities of the Toronto Parks, Forestry and Recreation Department has. And then you have 99.4 million for ravine strategy priority investment areas. So the opportunities that exist here is that perhaps there are individuals in this call, or individuals who, let's say there was an opportunity to purchase something and there was public funding, assuming being the city, there could be opportunity to use that as an opportunity to bring other sources of capital from, let's say, the foundation or private sectors who would be interested in this for diverse reasons as well. But the problems are that there seems to be a lot of rules around how the money that exists can be spent. So we'll get into that a little more throughout this presentation. These are all the tools that are in the research paper. I am happy to share that research paper with you all afterwards. It's available online, and I'll be talking about concessional finance in our presentation today, as well as green bonds and stormwater charges. So the Planning Act is what governs planning in the province, and Section 42 is the provision under which parkland is conveyed. This map is from the Parks, Forestry and Recreation Department, and the orange parts are the areas of deficiency. The darker the hue, the more deficient there is of parkland in that area, and it's likely to get worse with Bill 23, and I'll get into that in a moment. And I'll just go over how parkland is obtained. So it's either obtained, number one, when a development is proposed, the developer and the municipality agree on the size of the parkland that will be in existence physically on that site. Then secondly, there's the alternative parkland dedication rate, which a city like Toronto has decided to go with. And there is a calculation in terms of how much parkland can be dedicated physically off-site from the project in question at the property in question. And the City of Toronto in spring 2021 started to engage with industry and the public on how to update that alternative parkland dedication rate, because It was only based on the size of a property. So it didn't matter if you proposed a 20-story project or a 7-story project, you get the same amount of parkland. So what they did is that they went through this whole process, and then in August they announced the approval of a new bylaw and official plan amendment to make it responsive to density. So going forward, they would get more parkland from alternative parkland dedication rates. And it's in response to how much density is being proposed at a site. It's no longer just around the property, but that I'm unclear as to what that looks like right now because of Bill 23, and I'll get into that in a moment. And then the cash in lieu option is when it's not possible to dedicate parkland physically offsite or dedicate parkland on site of the actual project. There is a cash in lieu contribution that goes into a reserve fund, and those reserve funds exist across the province. There's an example from September that the city of Markham spent $188 million to purchase the Shoaldice Hospital lands and Thornhill for public use, and that was done with those reserve funds. So Bill 23 has wide-ranging implications and on parkland, and I need to thank park people for this information, for breaking it down. There's a reduction of 50% in terms of the parkland dedication rate for on-site. So we're going to possibly see less parkland dedicated on new builds. And when it comes to cash in lieu, the fees are reduced in half. When it comes to high-rise residential development, those parkland dedication rates are cut by half, and they're no longer responsive to density. It's just around property lot size. And if you're upset about this, I would suggest contacting by phone or email your local MPP and letting them know that this is a concern for you. So let's talk about financial tools and potential partnerships. I'll be talking about 3 tools: concessional finance, green bonds, and stormwater charges. Concessional finance is when a financial institution provides favorable loan terms in order to attract other partners to a project. So they may be willing to take a lower than market interest rate to reduce a project's cost of capital, but they do that to entice other partners to come into a project. So this makes it more attractive, and it can bring in multiple parties, and ultimately it can bring in more funding. So the example I'll bring up here is Forest Resilience Bond in California, where there is a $6 billion US funding gap for forest management and wildfire risks. This bond helps to scale and accelerate forest restoration in the Western US, where we're aware that this wildfires are an issue. And there are multiple partners on this. It includes Blue Forest Conservation, the Tahoe National Forest, the Utah Water Agency, and they all got together and used a $4 million US bond to protect 15,000 hectares of forest from wildfire risk. There were also, because they used the concessional finance tool, additional foundations that committed funding at below market rates. So that allowed for private investors like Calvert Impact Capital and CSAA Insurance Group to obtain higher rates of return. Concessional finance could be used in Toronto. It can be used for parkland acquisition. There can be pre-agreed set of outcomes in this. So you could you could identify and engage who the beneficiaries are of cleaner ravine water or lake water in parkland acquisition. Something I was thinking of was that I believe last year I remember hearing that there were reports of E. coli by the beach. So what if that was, you know, an indicator for justifying parkland acquisition where you had used concessional finance? You could use that as an indicator, like how many days are there of E. coli warnings by a certain beach. Anyway, Those are just some ideas to get you thinking and making it real. Next up are green bonds. So this is a form of debt. Bonds are a form of debt where the money is used and to fund predetermined activities. And a green bond is similar, but the labeling and purposes are different. For some of the real quantitative finance heads, they'll just say it's just the marketing. So it's a fixed income debt product that is issued to finance environmental projects. There's been high investor demand for this, as you can see with the, I guess you'd call it hockey stick sort of growth in recent years. It's going on in the public and private sectors. Last year, there was a global issuance of 481 billion. And I'd be curious to see what that number is going to be like this year. One of the key reasons that there's interest in green bonds is that they can be sold at a premium, and that reduces the cost of servicing the debt. So you can get a lower interest rate, for instance. So that's why there's interest on this. The pun isn't. So in Toronto, when there are cities that have green debenture frameworks, they come up with this framework, and then they can issue as many bonds as they want under a certain framework once this framework has been verified by a second or a third party to like verify that it's actually green, and people whoever the investors are can trust that it's a green investment. So in Toronto, there have been 5 green bonds issued with a cumulative value of 1.18 billion Canadian since 2018. The most recent bond was actually announced November 28th, so very recent, and it was $300 million. The proceeds from green bonds in Toronto that are of interest to a group like yours would be to fund tree planting at a streetcar yard. So at the Leslie Barns, it's been used there. Also for the Portland's flood protection project, it's been used there. And even the most recent funding of the most recent bond issuance has proceeds being used for the Portland's flood protection project. It's also worth noting that if you're asking how do investors get paid, well, the payments to investors are funded through the city's general revenues. So there's an opportunity to use green bonds for parkland acquisition. If there are areas that you can think of that are flood risk zones or flood prone in the future, that would be a great way to promote the idea is saying, hey, we can mitigate flooding, we can protect the environment, we can have new parkland, and here's a tool that you can use, city, to do it. And it's also, worth celebrating this sort of homegrown innovation, because we're tough on Toronto sometimes, and this is something we're doing, and it doesn't get enough attention. So let's go to the next one. This is a breakdown, and hasn't changed. I checked earlier today. This graph hasn't been updated to include the most recent bond issuance, but you can see what the coupon rates are, what the amounts are that are being issued, and when they mature. Okay, so stormwater charges. So they are usually set by municipalities in 2 different ways: water consumption by property owners, or the amount of water runoff generated by those properties. The city of Mississauga introduced one in 2017, and it's billed by the region of Peel. The charge is calculated based on the amount of hard surface on a property. So they determine this based on recent satellite imagery, and the funds that are generated are used for stormwater management, specifically planning and operations, and new capital construction. The city of Toronto has attempted to introduce a stormwater charge in 2017 and 2021. The latest attempt resulted in a 3%, or the latest attempt seems to be the outcome resulted in a 3% increase in water rates for 2022 and 2023. The proceeds of which will go towards the annual capital reserve contribution I do not know if there is a stormwater earmark for that, but that's what I've seen in the research. I mean, and think also too with the Bill 23 discussion and the implications that there are for development charges, and if that it gets reduced, City of Toronto has the jurisdiction to, according to my understanding, the City of Toronto Act, to use other financial tools. So why can't we use this as an option, and it can be used as a revenue stream for parkland acquisition? And if there's an interest on that and engaging on that issue, there's an interesting academic paper from work that was done in Detroit where they engaged equity-seeking groups on green infrastructure projects there. And what they did is that they had visualization technology, and they would come up with this idea, and then they would go to the group, ask for the neighborhood asking for advice, and iterate based on that. So there could be an engagement opportunity around this if you went down the road of seriously looking at parkland acquisition, bringing those stormwater charges. Another idea to put on the table. Okay, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. This is an idea that they're basically Indigenous-led and or stewarded conservation, where Indigenous peoples use their traditional knowledge to conserve land in partnership with governments. And I think it's a great opportunity to embark on reconciliation and bring it all together, and if we were to do this in Toronto, how would we do it in a way that's not extractive? I think that's a really important question to consider. And the blue dots on this map are in BC, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, and they are the locations of current IPCAs. IPCAs, or where potential IPCAs are being considered, tend to be in rural or northern areas, as you can see. And I'll just highlight, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's this one that I'll be talking about briefly in the next slide. But if this were to happen in Toronto, Indigenous-led conservation would mean engaging the Municipal Indigenous Affairs Office and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation as first steps. So the federal government has been really supportive of this. Sometimes it's been occurring at the with the lack of agreement of provincial governments. So in BC, this is the one I was trying to show earlier. There's the Cascadena community that has announced that they're doing an IPCA, and that would be the red portion. There, from what my understanding, there's been disagreement with the province in terms of how much land can go towards that purpose, but you can see like how this is a rural part of the country compared to Toronto, and you can see that it's so their territory goes into Yukon as well, right? But this is just to show you an example and to show something that's being worked on at the moment. Overcoming bureaucratic barriers. So I also identified some opportunities and barriers that exist in how parkland acquisition reserve funds operate. And those major barriers are that there are, how do I say this, like many rules to how funds can be spent, right? So and here I'm putting more ideas on this slide of how they can be overcome. So an idea I have would be to set up a new municipal agency on overcoming obstacles. So for instance, you would have individuals who have real estate background or finance background and care about parks and know how to move to let's say hopefully quickly to purchase parkland where it's needed. But I think to make something like that function, we would need to remove some of the barriers that exist right now, which include, for instance, the city cannot finance a purchase of parkland. It needs to quote unquote save up to buy parkland. So it can't walk into a bank and say, I have $10 million. Can I use that as collateral for, not collateral rather, but to use that as a way to obtain 30 million because I need 40 million to make the purchase. The city cannot do that. So perhaps there needs to be changes for the city to be able to do that in the future. And also other rules that for some things, the city needs to get council approval to use reserve funds. And in some cases, the reserve funds can be located in different fund pots. So I also with municipal new agency ideas, taking inspiration from, for instance, Metrolinx. Some of you might remember that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, transit priorities were hard to get done, in part because different agencies wanted or organizations wanted to do things a certain way. And with Metrolinx, I'm not commenting with how they do things, but the fact that they are a professional organization whose role is to move transit construction and get it going. You know, in terms of just pure functions, there can be inspiration taken from that for a new municipal agency. And there are other examples of government agencies that function like this that you can look at. But also to take a financing approach for parkland acquisition, you would also need the province to allow for cities to finance purchases. And why can't that be something that's asked for of our MPPs at the moment? So this seems like there's openness to new ideas. But that would be something that could speed things along, because it would certainly make the process a little easier for acquiring parkland, given the high cost of land. Another thing too is that some officials may not love the idea of using quote unquote private sector tools. And some officials may not have the skills to understand some of these things as well as, let's say, someone who's worked in finance. So I think part of this is just a process as well of engaging counselors or engaging staff, and like saying there's open-mindedness and hopefully open-mindedness to making some of these things happen based on new ways and new tools, not always doing it the same as before. This picture is from the Rouge in the fall. So 2 main takeaways from this presentation are, number 1, to think creatively about funding parkland acquisition. Number 2, center equity seeking groups and financing strategies. You'll get better ideas, better buy-in, better support. And frankly, that's, you know, just how our society should operate. And my call to action is to write or call your MPP about Bill 23, as well as reaching out to your counselor. You know, there's been a turnover of 1/3 of council. It's a new term, and there could be receptiveness to these ideas. So thanks a lot. This is my contact information, and also my blog/consultancy is called The Urban Hulk. So I'm happy to have conversations if you're interested in working together. And you know, thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take your questions. I see that there are a lot of chat notifications that I haven't looked at them, but let's have that conversation now. Okay. Phil, how do you want to do this? Okay, maybe I'll go through some of these questions in the chat first. Yes, I believe these slides can be shared.
Here we go.
Hey,
Here,
Phil.
I can take it over. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much, Jean-François. I really appreciate that presentation. And it's going to stimulate our brains to think more imaginatively about how we can get the money we need to purchase the land for new parks in the area. Why don't we go through the questions that were already posed in the meeting chat, and we'll see if more come. If they don't, I have a few questions I'd like to ask you as well.
Sure, I'll start with Rita's around, are green bonds something that individuals can invest in? Typically, they're not. I mean, there can be a community bond that, you know, gets developed where individuals can invest, and as well as institutions, but usually no, green bonds are not. They're for institutional investors. With respect to stormwater charges, if a homeowner covers over green space with stones, are they charged? I would assume yes. If I was in Mississauga, and I understand York Region also has one, that they would be charged if they cover over green space with stones. So, but
I
mean,
think probably we don't have an answer to that question. I think it's basically, are there disincentives in the system to discourage people from covering green space with concrete or brick or whatnot? So I don't know the answer to that question, but maybe some of the municipalities have that disincentive. Seems like it would be a good idea.
yes. There's another question from Rita around the city allowing a campaign for the public to also contribute to saving a grand red oak by buying the property. Is this a model which could be applied to purchasing local land in communities which are deficient in public green space or in sensitive areas which should be protected? Yes, I mean, if you buy a property and you want to take down the house and make it a park, I don't think there's any rule saying you can't do that. I mean, when I was in Detroit a few years ago, I saw the outcome of that with some urban farms where that happened after the financial crisis, where land was so cheap, people bought these properties and converted them to other functions, right? I guess it all just comes down to if you have the funds to do that and the buy and like the agreement, or that's your interest in doing. I don't see why, like I don't see why anyone would say you can't do that. Lenka says this could be potentially a way to create more protected areas out of Toronto, but not so much relief for Toronto's natural heritage located in the central city. The ESAs, I'm not sure what that is, are mostly surrounded by high density development that in most cases ignored protection policies in terms of cumulative impacts of increased use of the adjacent natural heritage. That seems to be a comment. The next one seems to be a comment as well. If you don't have the from Felix, if you don't have the funds or capital, what role might one play in this? Felix, do you want to elaborate on that point? Okay, thank you, Michelle.
I think what we would do is lobby for more funding at City Hall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you're well positioned to do that.
Yeah, and we're in a good position to do that, and we have an advocacy committee that's working on that. So we need to get councillors more aware of the importance of parks to the people who live here, and to devote more thinking cap time and material to getting the money for that.
I want to take Janet's question because she has her hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself, Janet, and ask your question?
Thank you. I live in the St. Clair and Bathurst area, and there's a lot of development coming along. The city advertised, they wanted our input on 3 parks coming to our area because these were the development charges agreements, I guess, the developers agreed to put parks in. Well, they turned out to be like parkettes, like tiny little postage stamp parks, and they wanted our input. And the survey that I completed, it just gave you so few options to choose between. Do you want a swing set there, or do you want greenery? I mean, it was like almost like either or. You could have a park, for a little tiny postage stamp park focused on kids, or you could have 2 trees. I mean, I'm being a bit facetious, but the way things are now, the developers who are putting in high-rise condos are obliged in some regard, I guess that's the right word, to give us a park. So sort of, I mean, but we're not really getting parkland for that. It's just public space. So I guess my question is, to me, these are not parks, but the city's trying to position them as parks because that's what the survey said. You're getting 3 new parks in your area. And they had signs on the hydro poles and everything about this survey, which I did complete, asking for green space. So Is there anything that can be done in that regard to, if developers are going to keep building, which they are, can we get them to contribute to real parkland, like not this joke of a parkette idea?
It's a big question. It sounds like you have two angles to approach it from. You can let the Parks, Forest, and Recreation Department know that feedback, because my sense that there's sometimes this these different conflicting priorities around recreation, which would be perhaps a swing set versus, maybe you want to see an apple tree there because you want to pick apples in 10 years, right?
Yeah.
But they might say they might call that not parks, but anyway, I'm digressing, but those will be two different angles, you know what I mean? And it's also from the developer side, I think it's also worth engaging with them, going to those meetings, and hopefully it's not just you, and others also letting them know, hey, we want to see more real parkland, which I'm assuming you mean things like native species or species that have always been here, and real biodiversity, so you can see some bees there in 3 years or something.
Yes.
Right. And I mean, there are certain developers that try to be progressive on these fronts. TAS, for instance, is one of them. But I certainly think that now that's going to be like a stakeholder to really engage on this, because some cases would make their project more attractive, right? So
Thank you for that question. There's a question from Sharon. Jean-François, would asking for charges in zoning to park from residential or commercial be useful?
I would say yes. I mean, it seems like we're in a time where we can propose all sorts of ideas. So why not? Would it happen? I don't know, but why not ask? I can't think of an example where this has happened locally, but I'm not going to say no to you.
Great. Michelle has asked, I am struck by how many corporations like to have their names on buildings. Could this same kind of philanthropy work for parks if the contribution was recognized?
So the Meadowway is an example of this in Scarborough, where I'm not sure who came first, but I know the Weston Foundation, I understand, was willing to put more money forward if another group put more money forward. I don't know if that group was the city or the federal government, but basically it led to there being a greater pot of money so that more could be done, right? And I'm sure I understand that there's some recognition of the Weston Foundation there. So I'll be honest, I haven't visited in a while, but I think that's certainly an angle to approach. There's this discourse in Toronto that we have no money, but there's a lot of money here in private hands. So we need to find a way of unlocking that. And this is the way to do it. And there's openness to it. It's worth exploring.
Jean-François, I have a question. The city has budgeted about 21 million plus in capital funding per year over the next 10 years. I guess if you multiply by 10, that's probably the amount of the reserve fund that's there. Is this an adequate sum, 21 million a year, for acquiring new parkland and new natural areas to keep up with population growth? And if not, why? Do you have an idea what scale we're really talking about in terms of money needed to at least keep pace with per capita growth?
That's a really good question, Phil. When I was writing my major research paper, I looked at what a group that I believe was a Nature Conservancy and another group whose name is escaping me right now. They did a paper on different financial tools, and they identified that in Canada there's a large, I believe it was a 15 to 20 billion dollar biodiversity funding gap. So what I said is that in Toronto would be 1.5 to 2 billion biodiversity funding gap. Biodiversity, doesn't just include parkland, it includes other things. But so I think my answer is that it's hard for me to tell you what the number is, Phil, but I mean, if 1.5 billion is a number that I'm throwing out there, maybe 21 million per year is a little low, especially with the value of some of these properties that you would need to purchase if you wanted to provide more parkland in certain more urban areas where the price of land is expensive. But I also think it takes, the support of groups of dedicated individuals like yourselves to, let the city know, hey, we care about this, and maybe it will lead to there being more funding or more of a priority being placed on this, more speed going on it. I think we should take Madeline's question because she's had her hand up. Is that okay, Phil?
Great. Madeline, go ahead.
A great deal of, guess I better do this one too. A great deal of the parkland in Toronto area is owned by the Conservation Authority and administered by Toronto Parks. I don't think we should be counting that completely as Toronto parkland because the city is not adequately maintaining it. Also, in the area of Black Creek, Lavender Creek particularly, the city owned land that was part of the I'm blanking.
That's okay.
It's the area in the flood, just outside the floodplain in at Black Creek and Lavender Creek, part of the land for road maintenance over a period of the last 40 years, and the city has sold some of it off to be used for industrial purposes, as opposed to maintaining it and expanding the parkland in the area, particularly in an area prone to flooding. People have been objecting to this, but it doesn't seem to get us very far. Also in the area across the city that the Meadowway is part of, the hydro corridors are excellent possibilities for parkland, but again, in the Emery Creek area, the Emery Village BIA did a study and wanted to fund parkland as an Indigenous park in Emery Village, and they coughed up the money for it half a dozen years ago, and there's been nothing happen yet. I don't think the city has been supportive.
I did not know that.
Bureaucracy is slow, isn't it? Any comments
It
on
ain't
that?
slow, it's impossible. It's like there are brick walls. You go under them, over them, around them, or through them.
Right.
And I'm getting to the point where I want to go through them.
Right. Good for you. Okay. Let's see. I think we might have time for one or two more questions.
Lloyd just asked. I just raised his hand. Floyd, do you want to ask your
please.
question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi there. Just like to know folks' opinion on it. Along the East Don, just south of Eglinton, is Flemington Park Golf Club. It's privately owned. It's about 40 acres of land. Developers looking to purchase land and put up 4 towers. Not on the golf course, the flood zone, but it still is below the stable top of slope. There already are 4 or 5 other condos on the tableland. The position is we're going to give the city 40 acres of parkland. Give the city 40 acres. Now, before Madeline spoke, I would think, well, what can you do? You can't do anything with that land as a developer that's in the regulatory flood zone. But obviously, in the West End, they can, if they're going to put some industrial operation in the regulatory flood zone. So my question, do we say it's okay to build in the ravine, which is not part of the ravine strategy. It's not part of City Toronto bylaws. It's not part of TRCA regulations either, because we're going to get free, and I'm going to put great big air quotes around that, free parkland, which the city will have to develop and maintain. So I'm just throwing it out to see if anybody has an opinion. I object totally to this. I've been to their first two meetings. It hasn't gone to the city yet, but I expect that would probably get approval. But one of the things I also saw that Lenka had something else here. One of the things, the other things about Bill 23 is that it eliminates development charges. Development charges to developer pays for infrastructure, water, sewer, schools, community center, and the like. There won't be any money, Section 37 money, going to parks. So I just want to know people's opinion about the Flemington Parklands development.
Yeah, I can take that. I think this is a very important debate within TFN itself, whether we should support or not support that particular development. Is it a potential model for municipal golf courses that might provide a good model, or is it a terrible precedent for developing the area, which I think probably you feel? And I don't think the TFN board has made any decision about that. And I think you should make your opinion known to the board, and others should also make their opinion known to the board in that respect.
Well, Philip, my opinion is it's well known and well publicized. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm new to the board, so it's great to hear your point of view. Do you have any thoughts on that, Jean-François? In other words, it's a private golf course that could be turned over to the city, that would be bought and owned by the developer in return for the developer being allowed to put towers on tablelands above the wet areas. Do you have any thoughts on that? And if you don't worry.
Sorry, Philip, I just want to clarify. The condo development is not on the tableland. It's below the stable top of slope.
Okay.
I believe that it's actually going to go on the road allowance for Old Eglinton Avenue, which used to run past there. Okay. So just to be clear, this is not allowed at the present. And just I agree with you, your sentiment. It sets a terrible precedent for future development, any ravine, anywhere.
Right.
I mean, the only thing I would say is it just seems like the historic memory that we have of Hurricane Hazel's really being tested at the moment with these regulatory changes. And I hope that some of these changes don't go through or are reversed, because I don't think that there should be such developments like this happening that are in such flood prone areas. Developers will always try to get as much as they can, as close as they can to the edge. And I think it's incumbent on public policy to really make sure that it doesn't get that close to flood risk, flood prone area. I mean, that's the best answer I can give without knowing the specifics of the case.
Thanks very much. Let me.
I see a question. I saw a hand raised, physical hand raised from Zunaid.
Okay, Zunaid, yeah, go ahead.
We were contacted. The project's called DV Reconnects, I believe.
Okay.
We were invited, just for folks who don't know, I'm board member and president of TFN. We're invited to participate in conversations. So a number of folks representing a variety of our committees attended the consultations. Our stewardship folks were hand in hand with what's happening in the ravines, as well as advocacy. Our position is we haven't made any sign of supporting or not supporting. We are reviewing what they are proposing. The build is not on floodplain. What they are proposing in terms of parkland is where the floodplain is. But we are looking at it and haven't made a decision. We have some serious concerns about the proposal. And the board will actually get a report soon from our folks that have attended these meetings and make a recommendation on what TFN's position.
Great. Zunaid, thank you very much for clarifying. why don't we just pose one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Ellen to tell you about what's coming up.
I saw Lenka's hand go up, actually,
Oh.
Phil.
Okay, let's go with that. Lenka, go ahead.
Hi. So far we've been only discussing floods in terms of how close so far development should be to the ravine of natural heritage. But from what I see in Toronto, and specifically in the central area, such as downtown, High Park area, the waterfront, high density is as much problem for natural heritage or ravine as anything, because if we increase use and density within 500 meters of walking distance, then we are creating impacts, long-term impacts, cumulative impacts that are not sustainable from a perspective of any ravine, not to mention protected natural heritage. So density matters. And at this point, we still have the laws, provincial policy statement, which was fully adopted into the city official plan. Unfortunately, those policies were not implemented at the point of many important developments nearby natural heritage in Toronto. So here we are with the Bill 23, the city already not implementing fairly progressive policies existing. So the situation is really difficult, and we have to think hard what to do next.
But
The only thing I'll say in response to that is that, thanks for that comment. What it made me think of is that one of the weaknesses to Bill 23 of numerous weaknesses is that it didn't take an opportunity to promote as of right permissions for there being triplexes or duplexes or quadplexes allowed in established neighborhoods. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had as well. I mean, if we don't want, let's say, a high density project in a certain flood prone area or flood risk area or near it, I mean, there needs to be a conversation around, okay, but what about having more density within our own neighborhoods? Because maybe it will release that pressure from proposals like that in the future. Just a thought.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. I think we need to wrap up. We're at 3:30, and Ellen has some announcements to make. Jean-François, thank you so much for your presentation and putting some new ideas into our heads about how we can raise the capital we need to build our park system here in Toronto. Thanks again very much, and best of luck to you. And stay with this.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I'm very impressed with the level of engagement, insight, and passion that all of you have in this area. So, you know, I also good luck with your work on that too. Okay,
I'm going to turn over to Ellen now.
Okay, hang on a sec here. Thank you, Philip, and thank you very much, Jean-François. That was a really, really thought-provoking conversation and presentation. And let's not stop talking about it. Let's just make this the beginning, because we know that we need both more density in the city and we need more parkland. So we do need to find a way to square the circle. If we decry the idea of Bill 23, which sprawls all over the Greenbelt, then we do have to take on board that the people do need to live in the city. And so people are going to want to live here, and we do need to find room for them, but we need to have parkland as well. So I think that's the real intellectual challenge. And I think you've given us lots of tools to, you know, to really make that real. So let's look quickly at what we're going to be talking about at our next Zoom event. The TFN Zoom event is actually going to be a panel of discussion about Phragmites. And it's February 5, 2023. So we don't have one in January, but in February at the regular Sunday afternoon, 2:30 p.m. And the panel will include a whole bunch of experts, including Dr. Janice Gilbert, Lynn Short, and Jessica Arachi of the City of Toronto. So do look out for that. And this will give you a sense of the whole lecture lineup that we have through to next May, including a focus on coyotes in March, the work of the Turtle Conservation Center in April, and the whole issue of earthworms, that some of which have been introduced to Canada almost a century ago, but a whole new suite of so-called jumping worms, which are arriving and are spreading very quickly. Let's also not forget that on February 4, Saturday, February 4, we have our annual online nature images show, where we encourage Toronto field naturalist photographers and videographers to share their images. And you still have until January 21st to connect with Lynn Miller, and connect with Lynn by going to volunteering@torontofieldnaturalists.org if you'd like to have your images included in this show. It's always fun, and not just for the participants, but for everybody else as well. We have a number of walks that are being guided walks that are happening in December, including at Coronation Park, at Downsview Park. We have the history of Toronto's railways coming up, and right through to Boxing Day on the Spit. So those are all upcoming December walks. And I know Zunaid has something he'd like to say as well. And let me just pass it over to Zunaid right now.
Thanks, everybody. With regards to the recording of this lecture, it will be posted on TFN's website, but I also put in the chat our YouTube channel, where we post all of our lectures, and this one will be up there as well for folks who are asking where the lecture is available. That's all I have to say, Ellen. Excellent.
Okay, well, there's still sunshine out there, people. So do get out there, and thanks again, Jean-François, for a wonderful presentation. And we'll see you again February 4 for the Toronto Nature Images, and February 5 for the next the panel discussion on Phragmites. So take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.